Ma'am, your looks like mommy, the single dad's little girl said at the cafe, and then her reaction changed everything. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. The rain had been coming down steady for 3 hours by the time Theo Palmer pushed through the door of Corner Grounds Cafe with his daughter Ava tucked under his jacket trying to stay dry, and the place smelled like coffee and cinnamon, and that particular kind of warmth you only get in small-town cafes where everybody knows your order before you open your mouth. Theo shook water from his hair and steered Ava toward their usual corner table by the window, the one with the wobbly leg that nobody else wanted but they'd claimed as theirs 2 years ago, when he'd needed a place to work that wasn't haunted by his dead wife's absence. He was a mess if he was being honest. 34 years old and raising a 5-year-old alone while trying to keep his freelance graphic design business afloat, and most days he felt like he was doing both things badly. His hoodie had a coffee stain from yesterday, his glasses kept sliding down his nose because he'd never gotten around to tightening the screws, and his hair looked like he'd styled it with a tornado. But Ava didn't seem to care that her dad was basically held together with caffeine and determination. She climbed into her chair and immediately pulled out her crayons and paper, already chattering about the picture she was going to draw. "I'm making mommy today," Ava announced with the kind of certainty only 5-year-olds have about their artistic abilities. "She's going to have yellow hair like the sun, and green eyes like grass, and freckles like the ones I have." Theo's chest got tight the way it always did when Ava talked about Sarah, which was constantly because apparently grief didn't stop kids from wanting to know everything about the parent they lost. He ordered their usual hot chocolate for Ava and the largest black coffee they made for himself and settled in to work on his tablet while keeping half an eye on his daughter. "Tell me about mommy again," Ava said without looking up from her drawing, and Theo smiled despite the ache because this was their routine, had been for 2 years now. "Your mom had blonde hair that she always wore in a ponytail because she said it was practical, and green eyes that changed color depending on the light, and freckles across her nose that she used to complain about but I thought were perfect." He described the way Sarah laughed with her whole body and how she couldn't carry a tune to save her life but sang anyway, and Ava soaked up every word like she was memorizing them. That's when the cafe door opened again and a woman stumbled in from the rain. No umbrella, soaked to the bone, and Theo glanced up out of habit before his brain completely short-circuited. The woman looked exactly like Sarah, and not in a vague, "oh, she has similar features" kind of way, but in a, "this could be her twin standing there dripping on the floor" kind of way. Same blonde hair plastered to her head, same build, same way of pushing wet strands from her face with shaking hands, and Theo felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. The woman was younger, maybe early 30s, and she was clearly struggling, wearing a cheap coat that wasn't warm enough for November and carrying a backpack that looked like it held everything she owned. She approached the counter and ordered the smallest coffee they had, counting out exact change from her pocket with the kind of careful desperation Theo recognized from people who were counting every penny. She took her cup and sat 2 tables away, hunched over like she was trying to disappear. And Theo couldn't stop staring because the resemblance was so strong it felt impossible. Ava had gone completely still, her crayon frozen mid-stroke, and Theo realized his daughter was staring too. "Daddy," Ava whispered, her eyes huge, "that lady looks like my picture of mommy." Before Theo could respond, before he could stop her or even process what was happening, Ava slid out of her chair and walked straight toward the stranger's table with her drawing clutched in both hands. "Ava, honey, wait," Theo started, but she was already standing in front of the woman looking up with pure wonder on her small face. The woman glanced down, confused, probably wondering why a random kid was staring at her, and Ava said in that clear 5-year-old voice that carried across the whole cafe, "Ma'am, your looks like my mommy." She held up her crayon drawing and then pulled a small photo from her coat pocket, the one she carried everywhere, the professional family portrait they'd taken 6 months before Sarah died. The woman looked at the photo and her face went completely white, every drop of color draining out like someone had pulled a plug. Her hands started shaking so badly her coffee cup clattered against the saucer, and she whispered, "Oh my God," in a voice that sounded like she'd been punched. "Sarah?" The name came out broken and shocked, and Theo was across the cafe in 3 steps because this woman knew his wife's name. This stranger who looked like Sarah's ghost knew who she was. "I'm so sorry. My daughter's very friendly. She shouldn't have bothered you," Theo said, reaching for Ava's hand. But the woman wasn't listening, was staring at the photo with tears streaming down her face. "Where did you get this picture?" The woman's voice shook. "This is, oh God, this is my sister." And Theo's entire world tilted sideways because Sarah had never mentioned having a sister, had said her family was complicated and she didn't talk to them anymore. And here was this woman claiming to be related. "You're Sarah's sister." Theo's voice came out strangled. "She never said, I didn't know she had." The woman looked up at him with eyes that were exactly the same shade of green as Sarah's had been, and she said, "We hadn't spoken in 8 years. I left home, and we fought, and I cut everyone off, and I—" She looked back at the photo, at Sarah's smiling face. "Is she here? Is Sarah here? I came back to find her, to apologize. I didn't know she—" Her voice trailed off as she took in Theo's expression and Ava's carefully neutral face that kids get when adults are talking about hard things. "Sarah died 2 years ago," Theo said, and he watched the stranger's face crumble. "Car accident. She was gone before the ambulance got there." The woman made this awful wounded sound and covered her mouth with both hands, and Ava very gently patted her arm like she'd seen adults do when someone was sad. "It's okay to cry," Ava said seriously. "I cry about Mommy too sometimes. Daddy says it means we loved her a lot." Mrs. Chen, who owned the cafe and had known Sarah back when she was alive, appeared beside them with tissues and that look she got when she was about to mother everyone, whether they wanted it or not. "You all need some privacy. Come on back to the corner booth. I'll bring tea." She herded them toward the back of the cafe, and Theo found himself sliding into a booth across from a woman who was apparently his dead wife's sister, and he had about 1,000,000 questions, starting with why Sarah had never mentioned her. "I'm Julia," the woman said when she could finally speak. "Julia Montgomery. I'm Sarah's younger sister. Or I was, She pressed her hands over her face. "I didn't know she was married. Didn't know she had a daughter. Didn't know she died. Nobody told me because I made sure nobody could find me." She looked at Theo with so much pain it was hard to meet her eyes. "We fought 8 years ago. Stupid family drama about the choices I was making, and I left and I was too proud and too stubborn to come back even when I wanted to." Theo felt anger mixing with his shock because Sarah had needed her family when she was dying, had tried to find anyone who might help with Ava if something happened to her. "We looked for you," he said, his voice harder than he meant it to be. "Sarah wanted her family at the funeral. We searched, but couldn't find any Montgomery relatives." Julia's face twisted. "I changed my name after I left. Went by my middle name Richardson for years. I was hiding from everyone, including myself." Ava, who'd been watching this whole exchange with solemn eyes, suddenly asked the question that cut right to the heart of everything. "Are you my aunt?" Julia looked at this little girl who she'd never known existed. This niece who looked like a perfect blend of Sarah and the man Sarah had apparently loved enough to marry, and fresh tears spilled over. "I guess I am, yeah." Ava considered this for a moment. "Mommy's in heaven now, but she's not sad there. And if you're her sister, then she probably wants us to be friends." They sat in that booth for over an hour while Julia explained where she'd been, and the story that came out was one of addiction and recovery and 8 years of mistakes she couldn't take back. Had spiraled hard, and when her family tried to intervene, she'd run instead of getting help. She'd been sober for 3 years now, had slowly rebuilt her life, and coming back to town today was supposed to be about making amends and trying to reconnect with the sister she'd abandoned. "I was going to go to her house," Julia said, staring at her cold tea. "I had the old address memorized. I was going to knock on the door and beg her to listen to me, and now I'm sitting here finding out she's been dead for 2 years and I missed everything." Theo wanted to stay angry, wanted to blame her for not being there when Sarah needed her, but he could see genuine devastation in Julia's face, and he remembered Sarah saying once that her family was complicated and maybe there were reasons people stayed away. "Where are you staying?" Theo heard himself ask, and Julia laughed bitterly. "I just got into town an hour ago. I was going to figure that out after I found Sarah. I've got about $40 in a backpack, so my options are pretty limited." Ava tugged on Theo's sleeve, and when he looked down, she had that expression that meant she was about to ask for something. Daddy, she's Mommy's sister. We can't let her be lost with nowhere to go. Mommy would want us to help. Theo looked at this woman who was a stranger but also family, who looked so much like his dead wife it hurt to see her, who'd abandoned Sarah years ago, but was clearly drowning in regret now. Every logical part of his brain said this was a terrible idea, but Ava was right. Sarah would have helped someone who needed it, even if they'd hurt her before. We have a guest room, he said slowly. Just for tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next, but I'm not leaving you on the street. Julia stared at him like he'd offered her the world. You don't have to do that. You don't owe me anything. Theo's voice was flat when he answered. It's not for you. It's for Ava. She deserves to know her aunt, even if I'm not sure I trust you yet. The words were harsh but honest, and Julia nodded like she understood she hadn't earned anything softer. They walked out into the rain together, Ava holding Julia's hand and chattering about her room and her toys and all the things she wanted to show her new aunt, and Theo walked ahead with his shoulders tight, trying to process what he'd just done. Behind him, Julia was looking at Ava like she was something precious and breakable, and when they reached Theo's car, Julia whispered, "Thank you," so quietly he almost didn't hear it. The drive home was silent, except for Ava's voice filling the space. And when they pulled into the driveway of the house Theo had shared with Sarah, Julia saw the photos through the window and her breath caught. She was happy, Julia said, more to herself than anyone. She got married and had a baby and built a life, and I missed all of it. Theo unlocked the door and let them inside, where Sarah's presence was everywhere, in the photos on the walls, and the decorations she'd chosen, and the life they'd built together. And he watched Julia take it all in with tears streaming down her face. The first morning was awkward as hell. Julia waking up in the guest room surrounded by photos of a sister she'd abandoned and a life she'd missed completely. And when she came downstairs, Theo was already in the kitchen, making pancakes with his jaw set tight like he was reconsidering every choice that led to having his dead wife's estranged sister sleeping under his roof. Ava was the only one acting normal, chattering away about how Aunt Julia needed to see all her mommy's pictures. And she dragged Julia to the living room, where photo albums were stacked on shelves like a museum dedicated to everything Julia had thrown away. They sat on the floor together, Ava turning pages and narrating every single photo with the kind of detail only kids remember. And Julia felt her heart break wider with each image. Sarah's wedding day looking radiant in a simple white dress, Sarah pregnant and glowing with one hand on her belly, Sarah holding newborn Ava with tears of joy streaming down her face, Sarah at Ava's first birthday party covered in cake and laughing. This was 3 months before Mommy got her angel wings, Ava said, pointing to a photo where Sarah looked noticeably thinner, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. What do you mean? Julia's voice came out strangled, and that's when Theo walked in from the kitchen and said in this flat, careful tone, Sarah had cancer, stage 3, diagnosed 6 months before the accident. Julia felt the room tilt because this was new information, devastating information. She was fighting it, but the prognosis wasn't great, and she was terrified of leaving Ava alone. Theo's hands clenched into fists. She spent her last months trying to find you. Thought maybe if you knew she was sick, you'd come back. She was driving to your last known address the night she died. The guilt hit Julia like a physical blow, and she couldn't breathe. Couldn't process that Sarah had been dying and looking for her, while Julia had been too wrapped up in her own recovery to reach out. I didn't know, she whispered, but the words felt pathetic and useless. Theo disappeared and came back holding a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, and he threw it on the coffee table between them. She wrote you a letter a week before the accident. Never mailed it because she didn't have your address. I found it in her nightstand after she died and couldn't bring myself to open it. Julia's hands shook as she picked up the envelope, addressed to her in Sarah's familiar handwriting, and when she opened it and started reading, her vision blurred with tears. Sarah's words were achingly kind despite everything, apologizing for whatever role she'd played in their fight, begging Julia to come home, explaining about the cancer and how she was scared and needed her sister. The last line destroyed Julia completely. Please don't let pride keep us apart forever. I'm running out of time, and I need you to promise you'll be there for Ava If something happens to me, she's going to need her Aunt Julia. She was dying and begging me to come back, and I was too selfish and stubborn to even check in. Julia's voice broke completely. I could have been there. I could have met Ava. I could have said goodbye. Theo's anger finally erupted. Yeah, you could have. We needed you, and you were nowhere. Sarah called your name when she was dying, made me promise I'd find you for Ava. And where the hell were you, Julia? The question hung in the air, and Julia knew she owed him the truth, even if it made everything worse. I was in rehab, she said quietly. I'd years. I was a mess, and our parents tried to intervene, and I ran instead of getting help. That's what the fight with Sarah was about. She looked at her hands. I got sober 3 years ago, worked my ass off to rebuild my life, but I was too ashamed to come back. Didn't think I deserved forgiveness or a place in this family after what I'd done. Theo wanted to stay angry, but he could see genuine remorse eating Julia alive. And over the next few days, he watched his daughter bond with her aunt in ways that were both beautiful and painful. Julia knew all of Sarah's recipes because they'd learned to bake together as kids, and she taught Ava how to make Sarah's famous snickerdoodles. She knew the lullaby Sarah used to sing, and she sang it to Ava at bedtime in the same off-key way Sarah had. She even braided Ava's hair the exact way Sarah used to, and Theo had to leave the room because seeing it hurt too much. Then Sarah's parents showed up unannounced on day 4, and the second Margaret and Robert walked in and saw Julia sitting on the floor playing with Ava, all hell broke loose. What is she doing here? Margaret's voice was ice cold. You have no right to be anywhere near that child. Robert pointed at the door. Get out. You killed our daughter by not being there when she needed you. You don't get to play aunt now. Ava jumped up, her small body positioned between Julia and her grandparents, and her voice came out fierce in a way Theo had never heard. Aunt Julia is Mommy's sister, and Mommy loved her. I know because I read Mommy's letter. She ran to get the letter from where Julia had left it on the table and read out loud in her careful 5-year-old voice. Please don't let pride keep us apart forever. I need you to be there for Ava. She looked at her grandparents. Mommy wanted Aunt Julia here, so she gets to stay. The grandparents were visibly shaken, and Margaret started crying because she'd never known Sarah had written that letter, had never known her daughter had spent her last days desperately searching for the sister they'd all written off. They left without another word, and Julia stood there looking like she'd been hit by a truck. That night after Ava was asleep, Julia packed her backpack, and when Theo found her by the door, she said, I'm causing pain by being here. Everyone's grieving, and I'm just making it harder. I should go. Theo didn't argue. His pride wouldn't let him, and Julia knelt down to say goodbye to a sleeping Ava. She slipped a delicate bracelet off her wrist, half of a matching set, and put it on Ava's tiny wrist. Your mommy had the other half. We got them when we were kids and promised we'd always be sisters. Now you have mine, and she has hers in heaven. She kissed Ava's forehead and whispered, I'm sorry, before walking out into the night. An hour later, Theo was cleaning up and found Julia's journal wedged between couch cushions, and curiosity made him open it, even though he knew he shouldn't. The entries were dated going back 3 years, and they were full of Julia's journey through sobriety, her regrets about Sarah, detailed plans about how she'd apologize when she finally got brave enough to come home. The most recent entry was from yesterday. Ava looks so much like Sarah it hurts, but in a good way, like Sarah's still here in her daughter's smile. Maybe I can be the aunt Sarah wanted me to be. Maybe I can finally do something right. Theo's chest got tight because Julia hadn't been avoiding them out of cruelty. She'd been fighting her own demons and trying to become someone worthy of coming back, and he'd thrown her out the second things got hard. He ran upstairs to check on Ava and found her awake crying, clutching Julia's bracelet. She left like Mommy did. Everyone leaves, and Theo realized he'd made a terrible mistake. He grabbed his keys and told his sister to come watch Ava, and then he was driving through dark streets, checking every place he could think of. He found Julia sitting on a bench at the bus station with her backpack and Ava's bracelet twin in her hand, staring at it like it held all the answers she'd been looking for. And she looked up when Theo called her name, with rain starting to fall around them. Julia looked up when she heard Theo calling her name through the rain, and her face was a mess of tears and regret. and she clutched Sarah's half of the matching bracelet like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth. I was just about to leave, she said, gesturing to the bus schedule board. Figured it's better if I go now before I mess things up worse than I already have. Theo sat down on the wet bench beside her, not caring that rain was soaking through his jacket, and he pulled her journal from his pocket. I read this, he admitted. I know I shouldn't have, but I found it, and I needed to understand. And Julia, I'm sorry for how I treated you. His voice was rough with emotion. You weren't avoiding us because you didn't care. You were fighting to become someone strong enough to come back. And I threw that in your face the second things got complicated. Julia shook her head. You had every right to be angry. Sarah needed me and I wasn't there. Nothing changes that. Theo turned to face her directly. Sarah forgave you before she died. That letter proved it. And if she could forgive you, then I should be able to do the same. He took a shaky breath. The truth is, I was angry at everyone after Sarah died. Angry at God and the universe and myself. And when you showed up looking exactly like her, it brought all that grief back, and I took it out on you when really you're just another person who lost someone they loved. Julia's tears came harder. I don't know how to be an aunt. I miss 5 years of Ava's life. I don't deserve another chance. Maybe not, Theo said honestly, but Ava needs you anyway. She woke up after you left and said everyone leaves her just like her mommy did. And I realized I was doing to her exactly what grief did to me, taking away someone she loves because I was too scared to let anyone else in. He stood up and held out his hand. Come back, not just for tonight, but for real. Be part of Ava's life the way Sarah wanted. And maybe we can figure out how to be a family even though we're all broken. Julia stared at his outstretched hand like she couldn't believe it was real. And then she took it and let him pull her to her feet, and they drove back through the rain in silence that felt less heavy than before. When they walked through the door, Ava came flying down the stairs in her pajamas and launched herself at Julia with a force that almost knocked her over. You came back. You didn't leave forever like I thought. And Julia dropped to her knees and hugged this niece she barely knew, but already loved desperately. The next morning, Sarah's parents showed up again, and this time Margaret was holding a box of old photos. We were wrong, she said quietly to Julia. We spent 2 years blaming you for not being there, but we weren't there either at the end. We let our own grief keep us from helping Theo with Ava. Robert added, Sarah wrote in her diary about wanting you back, about regretting the fight. We found it last night after we left here. She never stopped loving you, even when you were gone. They sat together looking through photos of Sarah and Julia as kids, two blonde girls with matching green eyes and freckles, always together until life pulled them apart. And Ava studied each picture like she was memorizing proof that her family was bigger than she'd known. Over the next 3 months, Julia found an apartment 2 blocks away and got a job at a local bakery, and she became a constant presence in their lives, showing up for dinner 3 times a week and taking Ava to the park on Saturdays. She and Theo developed this careful friendship built on shared grief, sitting up late after Ava went to bed talking about Sarah and slowly healing the parts of themselves that had been broken by loss. They visited Sarah's grave together on her birthday, both crying and both finding comfort in not being alone with their pain. Ava bloomed under the attention, chattier and happier than she'd been since Sarah died, and Theo realized his daughter needed this connection to her mother's family more than he'd understood. On Ava's 6th birthday, which was also the day Sarah would have turned 34, they had a small party, and Julia gave Ava a locket with a photo inside of Sarah and Julia as kids. Your mommy and me when we were young, sisters forever even when we were apart. And Ava immediately put it on and refused to take it off even for bath time. That night after the party, Theo and Julia sat on the porch drinking coffee, and Julia said quietly, Thank you for letting me be part of this, part of her life. I know I didn't earn it. Theo's hand moved to cover hers on the armrest, and when she didn't pull away, he said, Thank you for coming back. Ava's happier than she's been in 2 years, and honestly, so am I. Turns out having someone around who remembers Sarah the way you do makes the missing hurt a little less. They sat like that for a while, hands touching, both aware something was shifting between them, but neither ready to name it yet. A year after that rainy meeting at Corner Grounds Café, They were back at the same table where Ava had first spotted Julia, and it had become their weekly tradition. Sunday morning breakfast where Ava drew and Theo worked and Julia read. Mrs. Chen brought them their usual orders without asking and said with a knowing smile, "You three look like a real family now." And nobody corrected her because it was true. Ava looked up from her drawing and asked with the blunt honesty only kids have, "Aunt Julia, can you be my mommy too? Not instead of mommy Sarah, but also." Julia's eyes filled with tears and she said gently, "I could never replace your mommy, sweetheart, but I can love you just as much in my own way." Ava considered this seriously. "Daddy says love gets bigger, not divided, so I can have mommy in heaven and you here, and it's not choosing." That afternoon, Theo asked Julia to come by after Ava was asleep, and when she arrived, he had legal papers spread across the kitchen table. "I want you to be Ava's legal co-guardian," he said without preamble. "Not adoption because she's still my daughter, but official family, someone who has legal rights to make decisions and be there if something happens to me." Julia looked shocked. "You trust me with that?" Theo smiled. "Sarah trusted you enough to ask in that letter, and I trust you now too. You've proven yourself every single day for a year." Julia signed the papers with shaking hands, and just like that, she became official family in the eyes of the law and not just in their hearts. 6 months later, the town dedicated a memorial bench in the park Sarah had loved, and Theo, Julia, and Ava stood together for the ceremony. The plaque read, "In memory of Sarah Palmer, beloved wife, mother, sister." And Julia gave a short speech about how her sister had given her a second chance through her daughter, and how she'd spend the rest of her life earning it. 2 years after that first meeting, Ava was 7 and running ahead of them in the park while Theo and Julia walked together with their hands intertwined. And it was impossible to say if they were romantic or just two people bound by shared love for a child and a ghost. But it didn't really matter because they were family regardless. They sat on Sarah's memorial bench and Ava climbed between them, and she looked up at the clouds and said, "I think Mommy's smiling. I think she's happy we found Aunt Julia." Sometimes a child's innocent observation opens doors that grief had locked shut. Sometimes the person who looks like who you lost becomes exactly who you needed to find. Sometimes estranged sisters get second chances through the nieces they never knew existed. And sometimes the best way to honor the people we've lost is to love fiercely and completely the family they left behind, broken pieces and all, until those pieces form something beautiful and new. If this story reminded you that family bonds can survive years of separation, that grief can bring people together instead of tearing them apart, and that forgiveness is possible even when the pain runs deep, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to believe in second chances. Thanks for being here with us.